Hello everyone, I hope you all had a great Christmas break and a happy new year. We are excited for 2021 and what God has in store for us. To start off the year, we have, as usual, some more worship and another message from Kinsey. So let's go ahead and begin. Cool. As I reflect, I find perspective. They're in the best and worst days of this life. You were always on my side. You're in the pain, you're in the promise, and on the days the furnace finds my faith, you're the fourth within the flames. I don't need to know what the future says, 'cause if the past could talk, it would tell me this: my God isn't finished yet. If He did it before, He can do it again. So I trust Him with what comes next. For the God I know is known for faithfulness. Yeah, my hindsight says I can trust Him with what's next. For the God I know is known for faithfulness. There's more ahead than what's behind me, and through the highs and lows and in between, God, you go ahead of me. And where you call me, I will follow. And if the water falls beneath my feet, then you pull me from the deep. I don't need to know what the future says, 'cause if the past could talk, it would tell me this: my God isn't finished yet. If He did it before, He can do it again. So I'll trust Him with what comes next. For the God I know is known for faithfulness. Yeah, my hindsight says I can trust Him with what's next. For the God I know is known for faithfulness. Who breaks the power of sin and darkness? Whose love is mighty and so much stronger? The King of glory, the King above all kings. Who shakes the whole earth with holy thunder and leaves us breathless and all in wonder? The King of glory, the King above all kings. This is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Our chaos back into order, who makes the orphan a son and daughter? The King of glory, the King of glory, who rules the nations with truth and justice, shines like the sun in all of its brilliance. The King of glory, the King above all kings. This is amazing grace. That you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered. done for me. This is amazing grace.
Hi friends, welcome back to another week of 4FIVE6 Online. I'm super excited you've decided to join us today as we keep moving right on through the life of David. If you weren't here last week, or if you've since forgotten what the heck we talked about, last week we left David and he had been told no by God. So David had wanted to build a temple for God, this like house of sorts, kind of like a church. And he had looked around, at this amazing house that he was living in and that God had like really blessed him with. And then he looked and realized God is living in a tent. And that doesn't seem fair to David. And so at the end of the day, when all was said and done and the chapter was over, God had told David that he can't do that. That building the house of the Lord is not David's job. And it wasn't part of God's plan for David. And so David had to let what he wanted, his plan, his hope, his dream, he had to let it go to follow after God wholeheartedly. Well, this week we pick up in chapter 9. So we skipped right over chapter 8, but I'm going to fill you in on exactly what happens. So in chapter 8, David had gone through and he had begun to consolidate power. He had defeated some longtime enemies of Israel and he brought peace to the entire nation. Way to go, David, right? So we pick up in chapter 9, and we're going to read through all of it, but we're going to jump around, start and stop, and all those things. So, chapter 9, verse 1. One day, David asked, "Is anyone in Saul's family still alive? Anyone to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" He summoned a man named Ziba, who had been one of Saul's servants. "Are you Ziba?" the king asked. "Yes, sir, I am," Ziba replied. The king then asked him, "Is anyone still alive from Saul's family? If so, I want to show God's kindness to them." Ziba replied, "Yes, one of Jonathan's sons is still alive. He's crippled in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. "In Lo-debar," Ziba told him, "at the home of Machir, son of Amiel." So, we're going to pause. We have King David, and he asks the people in his command if there's anyone from Saul's family that's still alive, because he wants to be very kind to them. Now, the Hebrew word for kindness that's used here is hesed. At least that's how I decided to say it. And it is a whole lot more than just being nice to someone. This Hebrew kind of kindness takes our idea of niceness to a whole nother level. It involves faithfulness and unconditional love for another person. It's undeserved and unrepayable most of the time. So David just doesn't want to be nice to someone from Saul's family. He wants to show unconditional love for this person. And there's this man, his name is Ziba, and he used to work the land for Saul way back when Saul was in charge. And then David acquired those lands when he took over. And so now Ziba knows the family of Saul, but also works for David. And so David asks, "Okay, who is it that's alive? You know of someone, Ziba, so who is it?" And Ziba tells him that there is one person in this place called Lo-debar. Now, when you break the word Lo-debar apart, it literally translates to no pasture land. So this crippled relative of Saul lives in a place of unimaginable desolation, a barren field, empty place, not happy. And not a place I'd want to live, right? So in verse 5, we'll keep reading, and we'll see that David sends for this crippled relative of Saul. So David sends for him, and he brings him from Machir's home, and his name was Mephibosheth. He was Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. When he came to David, he bowed low to the ground in deep respect. David said, "Greetings, Mephibosheth." And he replied, "I am your servant." "Don't be afraid," David said. So, we're going to pause. I know, we only made it through part of that verse. So this crippled man, Mephibosheth, right? He gets summoned by the king, which is not good most of the time. usually means you're in trouble. It's like getting called to the principal's office, or like when your mom uses your first name and your middle name. It's like equivalent, right? Not good. So he is probably freaking out right now, and here's why. In the time of David, when a king was overthrown, so Saul, right? We had Saul, he was the king, and he was usurped is the word that's used. He was overthrown by David, right? So David was not of the house and line of Saul, but became king instead when Saul died. So when the kingship changes from one family to another, typically that king would go around and would kill off any remaining relatives from the previous king. And here's why. Because any living relative of a legitimate king poses a threat to the current king, because they have a more legitimate claim to the throne than you do. So it solidifies their power and ensures that no one will take over from them. So what are the first words out of David's mouth? Like as soon as he meets Mephibosheth? Don't be afraid. And with good reason, right? Because Mephibosheth probably thinks he's about to die. So as we keep reading, we find out exactly why David brought him here. So don't be afraid, David said. I intend to show you kindness because of my promise to your father, Jonathan. I'll give you all the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here with me at the king's table. Mephibosheth bowed respectfully and exclaimed, Who is your servant that you should show such kindness to a dead dog like me? Then the king summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said, I have your master's grandson, everything that belonged to Saul and his family. It is now his. You and your sons and servants are to farm the land for him and produce food for your master's household. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, will eat here at my table. Because Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. That's in this for whatever reason. Important to know, I guess. So Ziba, he replies to David, and he says, Yes, my lord, the king. I am your servant and will do all that you have commanded. From that time on, Mephibosheth ate regularly at David's table, like one of the king's own sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah. From then on, all the members of Ziba's household were Mephibosheth's servants, and Mephibosheth, who was crippled in both feet, lived in Jerusalem and ate regularly at the king's table. Okay, so super happy ending, right? Like this son of Jonathan, gets welcomed in, gets to eat at the table, gets all of this land, so he gets super wealthy. But here's why it all happens. Do you remember back in 1 Samuel when we talked about David and Jonathan and their friendship that they had, like 1 Samuel 18, 19, and 20 probably? Well, at their last meeting, the two of them, they made this promise, right? This covenant to each other. Jonathan would ensure that David became king at whatever cost to himself. If David promised to take care of Jonathan's family. Well, this crippled man, Mephibosheth, is Jonathan's son. So David has full intentions of keeping this covenant promise that they made when they were teenagers, because he loved Jonathan that much. He wants to show this crippled man and this outcast undeserved grace. Mephibosheth hasn't done anything to earn what David is doing. He just gets it. David is helping the man whom he's never met before, not because it'll make him look good or it's the right thing to do. He is helping Mephibosheth because of a promise he made to a friend. Because David loved Jonathan like himself, because their relationship was so good and so close that David now loves Mephibosheth like he loved Jonathan, or like Mephibosheth was one of his own kids, because he loved Jonathan like a brother. Can you imagine having a friend like that? Now, my parents have friends that are very similar, Jeff and Janet. I have not known life without them being a part of it. And if anything had ever happened to my parents, Jeff and Janet would have taken us in and raised us as their own. And same goes for them. If something were to happen to both of them, we would take on their son, Jarrett. And this kind of friendship and kindness and grace is something that is so contrary to culture, to how we go about the world. The thing that David did for Mephibosheth, giving him land and allowing him to eat at the table, we call that grace, which is a very common word. You will hear it a lot of times. Some of you are probably even named Grace. But here's what it is. Grace is this unconditional demonstration of love that is undeserved, unearned, and unrepayable. One of my favorite authors, he said it this way. He said, grace isn't picky. Grace doesn't look for things that have been done to deserve love. Grace operates apart from the response or the ability of the other individual. Grace is one-sided. Grace is God giving himself in full acceptance of someone who doesn't deserve it and can never pay it back. And this is why the story of Mephibosheth and David is so important. Because we have this strong and this famous king who stoops down and reaches out to one person who represents everything that David's not. David wasn't crippled, but Mephibosheth was. David wasn't poor, but Mephibosheth was. David wasn't cast out and fearful of his life, but Mephibosheth was. And God does the same thing for us. God is everything that we aren't. He has perfect relationships and shows perfect love, and he never has once sinned. And we are fallen and we are sinful humans, but God, he chooses to love us anyways. And that's what grace is to you and I. We may not be physically crippled in the same way that Mephibosheth was, but we all sin. Yet God chooses to continue to work in and through us, and he loves us as if we were made perfect. So go in this crazy time when things don't make sense and the world seems to be falling apart. Know and live with the grace of God and understand that he loves you despite the sin that's in your life. Let's pray. God, thank you for today, for this time that we can come together and learn more about you, that we can learn about your servant David and about Mephibosheth and how amazing it is that we get to read about this story of grace within your bigger story of grace. I pray that we'll let that grace wash over us and go before us and beside us in all that we do throughout the rest of the week, and that you'll bring us all back here safely next Sunday for another look at David's life. I pray all of these things in your name. Amen. Well, as always, thank you for sticking around. I appreciate it. In case you were curious, yes, I had to practice saying Mephibosheth a bunch of times before I actually got it to where it sounded the way that it looks like it's supposed to be said. So you can do it too. You just have to try really, really hard. And then say it 12 million times in teaching, and you'll be good. So with that, may the Lord bless you, keep you, cause his face to shine upon you, and give you guys peace. I will see you right here next week.